Well, good evening. I'm your host, Robert Wilson with Cowboy Wisdom Hip Podcast. Tonight, 7 ways why egotistical arrogance is ancestor programming. Egotistical arrogance is never your personality. It's your ancestor survival reflex, still puppeteering your perceptions today. And when I read that today, I wrote that awakened me. That's the truth. That is very much the here and now veracity and authenticity, because we do act like that. It's old tribal coding that had to posture, dominate, defend, and pretend certainty just to stay alive. The ancient fear armor, that ancient fear armor never got updated, so the mind still runs it today, mistaking prehistoric instincts for modern authenticity. What people call ego is really ancestral struggle software, replaying itself through your nervous system like outdated firmware demanding obedience. 7 ways how deep the programming runs. The programming hides inside your normal emotions and everything. So exposing it feels like ripping up the floorboards of your identity. Ancestral scripts never announce themselves. They masquerade as personality, preference, and truth. When you expose them, you're just seeing patterns. You're not just seeing patterns, you're seeing the architecture of your inherited self. 7 ways why they hit like X-ray vision. The programming runs deeper than the belief. It lives in the reflex reaction and automatic interpretation. You never think ancestral programming, you perform it. And that is something that really awakened me today, because we do perform it. If you look in the real world today, out in the world, we perform ancestral programming. How the 7 ways expose how deep the programming runs. Set 1. They reveal the ego as just inherited reflex, never identity. Each way shows another layer where the ego is never you. It's ancestral survival coding replaying itself. The deeper you look, the more you see the ego is a hand-me-down script, never a sovereign explanation. And something else, you take the word self and start using the word sovereign, you stop going in to the replays of yesterday. They expose how the mind defends outdated instincts as if they're the truth. The 7 ways show you how the ego clings to ancient fear, logic, and calls it certainty, confidence, or reality. The programming runs deep because the ego mistakes old instincts for present moment intelligence. They show how the ego hides inside habits, reactions, and interpretations. I witnessed that in me. The 7 ways reveal that the programming is never loud. It's subtle, automatic, and disguised as normal. The depth is exposed when you see the ego operating before you even realize it's there. Now, how 7 ways expose how deep the programming runs. Set 2. They uncover the ego's oldest trick, calling it conditioning, conditioned truth. And 7 ways that peel back the illusion that your reactions are you. They're inherited scripts pretending to be perceptions. Depth is how long the ego has been lying about being the narrator of your life. My ego, I really awakened a lot to this, and there's going to be several shows on this because something I realized is most of the external world is egotistical, arrogant illusions. The show the ego repeats ancient patterns even in modern situations. The 7 ways reveal that the mind still uses prehistoric logic to navigate a world that no longer matches it. How do you see that today? I do. The depth is exposed when you see ancient fear coding driving modern choices, decisions, and your way of life. They reveal the ego's addiction to control, certainty, and superiority. I see that today, and something I still have, but I'm really rising above it because superiority and leadership is about listening and communicating, not being a dictator. Every way exposes another layer where the ego tries to dominate reality instead of witnessing it. The depth shows in how automatically the ego tries to run the show. And if you really look at it, that's when anger, hate, all that kind of stuff, that's egotistical arrogance. And illusions that you really have something. Why egotistical arrogance is ancestor programming. Arrogance is the inherited survival mode script pretending to be confidence. Your ancestors had to act certain, dominant, and unshakable to survive tribal threats, scarce resources, and unstable environments. The survival posture got passed down as strength, yet today it shows up as egotistical arrogance and outdated survival reflex masquerading as truth and reality. Arrogance is the ancient fear of being wrong, being exposed and powerless. In the ancestral environments, being wrong could mean death. That's very true. So the mind evolved to defend itself at all costs, even when it's wrong. The defensive reflex still fires today, creating the illusion of superiority. Arrogance is just ancient fear wearing a modern ego suit. I've had that one. You got to laugh at this stuff because we all do it. And you really see that in the world today, especially in a lot of the business world. Arrogance is the inherited identity armor meant to protect the tribe, never the authenticity. Ancestors survived by projecting strength, certainty, and authority to maintain order and hierarchy. Those behaviors became unconscious programming. Now the ego repeats them automatically, mistaking them for reality and truth. Arrogance is ancestral armor, outdated, rigid, and blind to present moment experiences and fresh foresight. Why challenges, chaos, adversity, and controversy are egotistical, arrogant illusions. The ego invents problems to feel like the center of the universe. My ego does that. Challenges and adversity aren't cosmic tests. They're ego dramatizing natural events to feel significant. The mind inflates ordinary life into chaos so it can play the hero, the victim, or the enlightened one. The illusion, the ego pretending life is attacking it so it can feel important. Chaos and controversy are the ego resisting reality and calling it resistance or truth. Life moves, the ego disagrees. This disagreement becomes chaos, adversity, or controversy. It's never reality. It's never reality causing turmoil. It's the ego refusing to let go of how it thinks things should be. That's an interesting one because I can see that. The illusion, the ego mistaking its own rigidity for external conflict. Adversity is the ego grieving the collapse of its expectations and calling the grief reality. When life doesn't match the ego's script, the ego mourns, then loses control, mourns the loss of control, and labels that mourning adversity. It's never the world causing suffering. It's the ego's arrogance insisting it's a fantasy was the truth. The ego's arrogance insisting that its fantasy was the truth. The illusion, the ego grieving its own failed storylines and projecting the grief onto the world. How do you see that in your life? I see that in my life. My mindset is egotistical, arrogant stubbornness. Mindset is the ego refusing to admit it doesn't control reality. The whole concept of mindset is the ego insisting, if I think hard enough, life will obey me. That's never wisdom, that's stubbornness pretending to be power. It's the ego clinging to the fantasy that thought equals authority. Mindset is the ego doubling down on its own beliefs instead of witnessing what's actually occurring in the life. Mindset culture teaches people to reinforce their opinions, never question them. It's the ego saying, my perspectives are correct. I just need to hold it harder and make people and enforce it more. This is stubbornness disguised as clarity. Rigid ways of life masquerading as strength. Mindset is the ego refusing humility by pretending it already knows the formula for life. I've done that many, many times. Affirmations, frameworks, and mental hacks all are ego tools to avoid the discomfort of never knowing. The ego would rather cling to a rigid mindset than surrender to authenticity and novelty. It's the arrogance of certainty over the freedom of perception. Egotistical arrogance is of certainty over the freedom of perception. Why self-help, personal growth, self-improvement, punctuated writings, and therapy are egotistical, arrogant illusions. They assume the mind that created the problem can fix it. Pure ego arrogance. Self-help and therapy often start with the premise that the thinking mind can repair the suffering the thinking mind created. That's the ego's favorite illusion. That's true. I can think my way out of a trap I built with thinking. That's the most wisest thing I've ever heard. The ego thinks, or you think you can think your way out of the trap you built with the thinking that got you into the trap. It's the mind trying to cure itself with more mind, a self-referential loop masquerading as wisdom. They turn life into a project, implying you're broken and need improvement. Personal growth industries thrive on arrogant assumptions that you're a flawed project needing upgrades, steps, and frameworks and fixes. That creates the illusion that your worth is conditional. Your being is insufficient. The ego loves this. It gets to stay in charge as the fixer, the solver, and the hero of its own struggle. They reinforce the past-based identities instead of dissolving. Punctuated writings and therapeutic narratives and self-improvement scripts often drag you back into the memory, the story, the drama, and the identity of it. They keep the ego alive by constantly revisiting who you were, what happened, and what needs healing and fixing. This is illusion. The ego pretending the past is still real so it can keep its identity intact. Why egotistical arrogance is ancestor survival mode, programming and struggles. Arrogance is the ancient survival reflex pretending to be modern confidence. Your ancestors had to protect dominance, certainty, and superiority to avoid threats, secure resources, and maintain tribal hierarchy. The survival posture got encoded as a strength. Today it shows you as egotistical arrogance, a leftover survival script, firing in a world that no longer requires it. Arrogance is the inherited fear of vulnerability, disguised as superiority. In ancestral environments, vulnerability meant danger, predators, revival, scarcity. So the mind evolved to overcompensate with certainty, bravado, and inflated self-importance. That reflex still runs today, creating the illusions of superiority. Arrogance is ancient. Fear is wearing the costume of power. Arrogance is the struggle era identity, armor passed down as truth. Your ancestors survived by acting unshakable, unquestionable, and authoritative. Never because it was true, because it kept them alive. Those behaviors become unconscious programmings. Now the ego repeats them automatically, mistaking them for reality. Arrogance is inherited armor, outdated, rigid, and blind to present moment. Why self-help, personal growth, self-improvement, punctuated writings, and therapy are egotistical, arrogant illusions. They assume the mind that created the problem can fix it. That's pure ego arrogance. Self-help and therapy often start with a premise that the thinking mind can repair the suffering the thinking mind created. That's the ego's favorite illusion. I can think my way out of a trap I built with my thinking. It's the mind trying to cure itself with more mind and references will keep the same loop masquerading as wisdom. They turn the life into a project, implying you're broken and you need improvement. Personal growth industries thrive on the arrogant assumptions that you're a flawed project needing upgrade steps or frameworks and fixes. That creates illusions that your worth is conditional and your being is insufficient. The ego loves this. It gets to stay in charge. As the fixer, the solver, the hero of its own struggle, they reinforce past-based identities instead of dissolving them. Punctuated writings, therapeutic narratives, and self-improvement scripts often drag you back into memory, story, trauma, and identity. They keep the ego alive by constantly revisiting who you were, what happened, and what needs healing. This is the illusion, the ego pretending the past is still real, so it can take and keep its identity intact. If you want, why change, heal, create, transformation, and forgiveness are egotistical, arrogant, fixed illusions. The ego assumes something is wrong with you, then arrogantly tries to fix the problem it invented. Change, heal, and transformation all start with the ego's premise. You are broken, something is wrong, something must be fixed. But the brokenness is just the ego's own judgment. The illusion, the ego diagnosing itself with a problem so it can feel heroic fixing it. The ego believes it's the authority to rewrite reality. Pure arrogance is disguised as self-work or self-help. When the ego says heal, transform, or forgive, it's really saying reality should have been different and I will correct it. This is the mind trying to override what had already happened. The illusion, the ego pretending it can edit the past and upgrade the present through mental effort. That's a fallacy. The ego uses transformation to keep itself alive, never to free you. Change, heal, and forgiveness keep the ego at the center of the story. You're the wounded one, the recovering one, the transforming one, and the enlightened one. It's all an identity maintenance. The illusion the ego is reinventing itself as a fixer so it never has to dissolve unwanted stuffings. Why mindset is an unadmitted egotistical arrogant illusion. Mindset assumes the mind is the authority of authenticity. That's pure ego arrogance. The idea of mindset is the ego declaring my thoughts determine truth. It's the mind pretending it's the cosmic power over life, outcomes, and reality itself. The illusion, the ego mistakens its internal commentary for universal law. Mindset is the ego trying to control life through thought, a silent superiority complex. Mindset culture says if I think correctly, life will obey me. That's the ego believing it can bend existence to its preferences. The illusion, the ego assuming life should match its mental settings. Mindset is the ego avoiding humility by pretending it already knows how reality operates. Mindset frameworks give the ego a false sense of mastery, steps, rules, affirmation, and formulas. It's the ego saying, I understand reality, I've got this. Yet it's self-referential fiction. The illusion, the ego protecting itself from not knowing by inventing mental certainty. Why the physical world is egotistical, arrogant illusions. The ego mistakes its sensory interpretations for reality. The physical world is experienced directly as it's filtered through the nervous system wiring. Ancestral survival coding and mental interpretation. Yet the ego arrogantly claims, what I perceive is what it is. It confuses interpretation with truth, turning its limited perceptions into a universal proclamation. It's having the images. It's not what its interpretation. It's the images with the outcome that you play on in your life. It confuses interpretation with truth, turning its limited perceptions into universal proclamation. The illusion, the ego, believing its five senses, define the entire cosmos. The ego projects meaning onto neutral phenomena. Onto phenomenons and calls it projection. The real world, the physical world, is raw, natural, unopinionated. The ego overlays danger, safety, success, failure, threat, and opportunity and identity to the story that's playing out. Then it defends those overlays as if they're objective facts. The illusion, the ego mistaking its mental labels for nature of reality. The ego uses a physical world as a stage to validate its identity and superiority. The body, the environment, the circumstances all become props for the ego's performance. The achiever, the struggler, and the enlightened one and the victim and the hero all play out together. The ego calls this reality, but it's just identity maintenance using physical form as evidence. The illusion the ego is turning the world into a mirror to prove its own importance. If you want, I can sculpt the pharaoh. Why indoctrinated education is an egotistical, arrogant illusion. It mistakes memorization for intelligence and calls obedience wisdom. Indoctrinated education trains the mind to repeat, recite, and regurgitate, then arrogantly labels the performance as knowledge. It rewards conformity, never clarity. It praises correctness, never perception. The illusion, the ego believing that repeating old information equals understanding reality. It installs the ego's superiority complex by ranking humans on artificial metrics, grades, degrees, credentials, all ego trophies, are all egotistical trophies. The system teaches people to measure their worth by external validation and hierarchy approval. This creates the illusion that some minds are better than others, and that's a fallacy. The illusion, the ego mistaking institutional approval for actual get your hands dirty wisdom. It conditions the mind to defend inherited narratives as truth. Indoctrinated education never teaches people how to think. It teaches them what to think. And how's that going on today? Then the ego clings to those narratives as if they're universal facts. This creates rigid certainty, intellectual arrogance, and resistance to new perceptions. The illusion is the ego believing its programmed worldviews, is reality itself. Why you don't think ancestral programming, you perform it. And this one was an awakening for me. And if you look out in the world, we're performing our ancestral programming. Ancestral programming fires before thought even awakens. By the time you think, the ancestral script already has chosen your tone, your posture, and reaction, and your interpretation. Thought is just commentary. The performance is already happening in your nervous system. You act out inherited instincts automatically. Then the ego claims it was a conscious choice. So that's the body reacts from ancient survival coding, dominance, defensiveness, certainty, and suspicion, and the ego jumps in afterwards to justify it. You never think the programming, you reenact it. Call it personality. The programming shows up in behavior, never beliefs. You can think new ideas all day, but the ancestral script reveals itself in how you move, speak, protect, resist, and interpret. The performance exposes the programming long before the mind admits it exists. Why fear, immaturity, insecurity are egotistical, arrogant illusions. Fear is the ego arrogantly assuming it can predict the future. Fear is never wisdom. It's the ego claiming it knows what's coming, and that it won't be able to handle it, that it won't be able to handle it. That's never humility, that's arrogant certainty about the imagined threat. Fear is the ego pretending its projections are reality. Immaturity is the ego refusing to release its outdated identity. Immaturity is never a lack of growth, it's the ego stubbornly clinging on to old emotional patterns because they make it feel familiar and control. It's the mind saying, I'd rather stay small than surrender my script. Immaturity is the ego, loyalty, never limitation. Insecurity is the ego worshiping external validation, calling it truth. Insecurity is the ego believing its worth depends on how others perceive it. That's the most arrogant illusion of all, the belief that other people's opinions define your being. Insecurity is the ego mistaking social mirrors for reality, while reality and truth are egotistical, arrogant illusions. Reality is just the ego mistaking its perception for the universe. Your sensors filter, your nervous system edits. Your mind interprets, then the ego declares this is reality. That's never reality, it's biological hallucination claiming cosmic authority. The illusion is the ego believing its tiny window is the whole landscape. Truth is the ego defending its conditioning as if it's universal law. What people call truth is usually just inherited beliefs, cultural scripts, and ancestral survival logic. But the ego clings to them with righteous certainty. The illusion is the ego mistaking its programming for objectives. Both reality and truth are the ego's attempt to avoid the discomfort of the unknown and not knowing. The mind can't stand the vastness of the unknown, so it builds rigid concepts and calls them the truth. It constructs a stable world and calls it reality. The illusion is the ego pretending the mystery is a map. And see, that's something I really opened up to, is how the world is an egotistical illusion. And how much of the outside world, and I was out walking today, and I really opened up to this. How much of the world are my witnesses thinking it's what it is, and it's an egotistical illusion controlling me? And that's mostly when things go abstract or off the rails, that's what chaos is. But chaos is showing you the ending of something, opening up the trails of triumph to move forward. And I want to thank you. I am Robert A. Wilson with Cowboy Wisdom, and may your day be as blessed as you are a blessing to me and the world.